Hello and welcome to the fourth of the StJohnsPipeCasts. And the topic of our conversation today is that of Disraelian conservatism. And we ought to begin by making it clear that Disraelian conservatism is not the same thing as Disraeli's conservatism. Disraeli's conservatism is really a set of ideas that Disraeli evolved through a long political career dating back to the 1830s, and was predicated upon what Disraeli called Britain's territorial constitution. The argument that Britain's distinctive political liberty rested upon the diffusion of power within Britain to those who owned land, be it the monarchy, aristocracy, country gentry, the church, Oxford and Cambridge colleges, corporations, charities, public schools, and so forth. It was this diffusion of power amongst these different landed interests that ensured, Disraeli believed, the distinctive quality of English liberty, and meant that Britain had avoided the perils of an over-centralisation of power upon an arbitrary or bureaucratic state of the form that Disraeli may believe existed in France. And Disraeli never personally relinquished this conviction that the diffusion of land ownership was the key to British liberty. And he always saw it as the essential duty of the Conservative Party to uphold this territorial constitution founded upon the diffusion of ownership of land. But this theory of the territorial constitution was not Disraelian conservatism as such, which is something much more specific. Now, Disraelian conservatism was a set of ideas and a form of rhetoric that Disraeli developed in the 1870s in order to fulfil a particular political function. And I can define it as follows: as an approach to politics that seeks to transcend the differences between members of a nation by the promotion and celebration of shared ideas and aspirations. At its heart is a recognition that, in the words of Enoch Powell, the life of nations is lived in the imagination. A nation is a construct, a work of artifice, what Benedict Anderson once called an imagined community. And if it is to be sustained, if that community is to be maintained in the imagination, then it must live within the hearts and minds of its citizens. If it is not so sustained, then centripetal forces will pull the nation apart, dissolving it into its constituent bickering elements. Now, why did Disraeli develop such an approach to politics in the 1870s? Well, quite simply, he saw the Conservative Party, if they were ever to end the long grip of the Liberal Party upon political power, by which point, of course, that could be dated back to 1830, if the Conservatives were ever seriously going to challenge this Liberal control upon power, they had to challenge the Liberal monopoly of ideas. Now, ever since Disraeli had entered politics, say back in 1832, Liberal ideas have been in the ascendant. I'm talking here about ideas such as individualism, laissez-faire economics, equality, rationalism, religious nonconformism, meritocracy, utilitarianism, and a kind of indifference to empire. And these ideas had dominated Victorian political discourse and left the Conservatives marginalised and seen very much, in the famous words of John Stuart Mill, as the stupid party, and as such unable to command a majority of electoral support in a progressive, increasingly middle class and educated society. In other words, with the Liberal discourse in the ascendant, the Conservatives seem to be relegated to the margins and frankly exposed as a kind of a gentry party and an anachronism in increasingly industrial, educated, middle class age. And as John Vincent has well argued, what Disraeli saw was that the Conservatives needed to challenge this Liberal narrative with a counter set of ideas if they were ever going to have the possibility of being taken seriously as a natural party of government. And this imperative became even more necessary following the 1867 Reform Act, which had enfranchised a large urban working class population. With the vested power of the landed classes visibly in retreat, Disraeli saw that the Conservatives needed a new kind of rhetoric if they were to win support not just amongst the newly enfranchised working class voters, but also of the growing middle class, who were disturbed by Gladstone's apparently restless and unpatriotic mode of government. And this attempt to challenge the Liberal political project, Disraeli really initiated in two major speeches in 1872. The first in Lancashire, in the Manchester Free Trade Hall, a very symbolic location, of course, being a hall founded in honour of the campaign to repeal the Corn Law. And second, at the Crystal Palace, also in 1872, in a speech addressed to the National Union of Conservative Associations. And the defining motive of this Disraelian conservatism was the importance of uniting the nation around its traditional leaders, its monarchy, its aristocracy, gentry, its established institutions, its church, while simultaneously portraying the liberals and their liberal ideas as essentially disruptive and essentially un-English. And I want now to review some of the elements of this Disraelian conservatism as was constructed by Disraeli in these early speeches of the 1870s. Well, the first element of Disraelian conservatism is that tradition is the surest guide to government. Disraeli once wrote that change is constant, but the point is whether change should be caused in deference to the manners, customs, laws and traditions of the people, or whether it should be carried in deference to abstract principles. And Disraeli, indeed through his whole career, had really rejected the concept of government by abstract principle, because human rationalism, humans in their kind of intellectual mode, cannot comprehend the complexity of reality. And politicians, therefore, ought to build upon the tried and tested practical traditions of British life, not apply to it a blueprint formulated in some professor's study or within the office of a think tank. Liberalism and utilitarianism were just such abstract models of the human condition and the practice of government. And the application of this rationalist approach to British institutions, and indeed of a nation, merely threatened revolution and the destruction of states. So the first element of Disraelian conservatism then is an emphasis upon the tried and tested character of British institutions and the practice of government. The second element was that the British nation, which was generally recognised to be an exceedingly successful entity, was in fact organised around its historic institutions. Such entities as the monarchy, courts of law, houses of Lords and Commons, the army, the Church of England. These were not really central to the good government of the country, but were actually valued as such by the British people. There's a kind of an emotional and respect and attachment to these institutions as such. And therefore these institutions, these historic institutions of England, ought to be celebrated and strengthened and not deprecated and reformed had been the dominant liberal narrative since the 1830s. And not only, of course, national institutions of the kind I've just enumerated, but also more local institutions such as Oxford and Cambridge colleges, London teaching hospitals, city guilds, public schools like Eton and Winchester. Disraeli delighted in all Britain's historic institutions. He loved Eton and Oxford, probably more than any former person had actually studied at these places. And the life of institutions too, he saw, was lived in the imagination. Rather than pulling them down and talking down British institutions, politicians, he believed, or certainly the Conservative Party, should be talking them up. And that was the second element of Disraelian conservatism. The third element of Disraeli's thinking at this time was the importance of trusting the working class. Now, Disraeli was very alive to the reality of class. As far back as the 1840s, in a novel called Sybil, He spoke of the rich and poor in Britain as being so different in their manner of life as to almost constitute a separate species. But where Marxists sought to inflame the fans of class antagonism, Disraeli wanted to overcome class difference, not by abolishing class, but rather emphasising points of common allegiance that held to all classes. To unite, in other words, rich and poor, capital and labour, through a mutual regard for the institutions and history of the British nation, to emphasise those things which united the British people rather than divided them into their separate class interests. And this national loyalty, this sentiment and feeling of Britishness as wrapped up in institutions, he believed was as strong amongst the lower classes as it ever was amongst the upper. And therefore Disraeli, unlike many liberals indeed at that time, did not fear the working class. And I quote again from Disraeli, he said, "I've always looked on the interests of the labouring classes as essentially the most conservative interests in the country." Now, while Disraeli did not go out of his way to enfranchise the working class, he believed, quite frankly, in the traditional hierarchies of power and authority within the land. When in 1867 he was responsible for a reform bill, he had no qualms, unlike, for example, an aristocrat like Lord Salisbury, about extending the right to vote to large numbers of the urban working class population. And his trust in the working class actually seemed to be vindicated. The working class have never voted for the kind of socialist spoliation of the rich, as many at the time believed they would do. And the Conservatives, since the 1867 Reform Bill, which gave a large part of the working class the vote, did consistently better in elections than they did before the enfranchisement of the working class. So the third element then of Disraeli conservatism is trust the working class, do not see them as a threat to the social order. The working person is as loyal to Britain as anybody else, and therefore there's no reason to be concerned about the extension of the vote to the working class as such. The fourth element of Disraeli conservatism is the concept of social reform. Now, to survive, Disraeli believed that the social order had to operate in the interests of all its members. Now, working people did not share liberal obsessions with reforming British institutions and the Constitution, which had been so much fixated on liberals, particularly under Gladstone's administration. What they're interested in, said Disraeli in his 1872 Manchester speech, were what he called the amenities of everyday life. Things like pure food, pure water, the inspection of unhealthy habitations, and the adulteration of food. And if the free market could not secure these things to the people, then it was, he said, the first consideration of a minister to uphold the health of the people. Thus we find Disraeli's 1874 government legislating in such areas as public health reform, artisans' dwellings, the Food and Drugs Act, and bringing in a maximum 56-hour week for women and children. And you can see, therefore, that under Disraeli's vision, a government which should be for the whole community should legislate in the interest of the whole community, and that included for the working class particular emphasis upon the factors that determine their concrete manner of life. What the working class were interested in, in other words, was not the kind of constitutional projects that intoxicated rationalist liberals, but rather the everyday bread and butter, nuts and bolts issues of clean water, clean air. And Disraeli in his 1872 Manchester speech pledged or promised that a Conservative government would place these direct working class interests at the heart of their legislative programme. And indeed, after 1874, when Disraeli was in power, his government was famous for this emphasis upon social reform as opposed to constitutional, institutional reform. The fifth element of Disraeli's conservatism is that of the theme of empire. And I think we can understand, look back to history, that few things better unite a nation than prestige in foreign affairs. And by the later 19th century, for British people, prestige in foreign affairs had pretty much come wrapped up with the idea of Britain as a great imperial power, the concept of empire. Now, for liberals like Gladstone, empire really was an embarrassing waste of resources, which ought to be discarded as soon as decently possible. Liberals did not believe the empire was sustainable. They believed it was something that Britain had come upon almost by unfortunate accident, and really ought to be encouraged to dissolve itself as countries like Canada, New Zealand, Australia would eventually sever ties and become self-governing nations, as the Americans had already done, of course, back in the 18th century. So the Liberals then were lukewarm at best on empire. Disraeli, of course, then took the opposite view. For Disraeli, empire epitomised Britain's position as a global power, and therefore should be deprecated and be felt embarrassed about, but rather should be celebrated and strengthened. And again, particularly the working class, he said, and I'm now speaking from his Crystal Palace speech, he said, the working class, he said, were proud of belonging to an imperial country, and no minister in this country, obviously referring here to Gladstone, will do his duty who neglects our colonial empire, and of responding to those distant sympathies which may yet become the source of incalculable strength and happiness in this land. Now, whether therefore it was keeping New Zealand and Canada within the empire, adding territories like Cyprus or Fiji to the empire, purchasing shares in the Suez Canal Company, or making Queen Victoria Empress of India, Disraeli saw the projection of imperial power as central to uniting Britons at home, as providing, again, a point of common reference. I might be working class, middle class, or upper class. However different I may be one with the other, we all of us, Disraeli argues, share as British people a loyalty, reverence, and celebration attitude towards the British Empire, something which unites us in pride and therefore transcends class difference, a perfect method of unifying the nation of the kind that Disraeli is projecting at this point. And I think I want to quote here again from Disraeli, who very well summed up his approach to what he called conservative politics. And Disraeli said that by the conservative cause, I mean the splendour of the crown, the lustre of the peerage, the privileges of the commons, and the rights of the poor. I mean that harmonious union, that magnificent concord of all interests on which our greatness depends. And these ideas are well exemplified in this cartoon drawn in 1872 in response to Disraeli's Manchester speech. And if you look at this cartoon, we can see Disraeli depicted in the middle, standing upon a bale of cotton. Appropriately, of course, this was Manchester, the centre of the British cotton industry. He's standing on a bale of cotton and he's playing the fiddle. And as he plays the fiddle, you can see dancing around him a motley array of English worthies, ranging from aristocrats and merchants on the one hand to bishops and members of the working class on the other. And this cartoon, in other words, I think quite vividly shows Disraeli in his Manchester speech as using a form of ideas and language, the fiddle playing, by which he was able to evoke support and enthusiasm from socially exceedingly disparate members of society. People who would never ordinarily congregate or associate are shown here joining together in adoration for Disraeli and his message. And this, I think, really is a spot-on depiction of what Disraelian conservatism it stands for. This idea of unifying classes around a kind of message upon which they can all agree, and I think would have caused Disraeli much pleasure. And it was with ideals such as these that Disraeli sought to unite the British people around the leadership of the landed class through the political medium of the Conservative Party. And I think you can see the astute nature of this move by Disraeli, because by associating the Conservative Party with this idea of national celebration of interests that transcend class, Disraeli was able to kind of turn the tables on the Liberals, depict them as a kind of vested interest group of a narrow kind of rationalist and middle class, almost un-English elite. And by positioning the Conservative Party as the custodians of Britishness, he was able to really kind of relaunch the Conservative project and keep what are essentially traditional interests, such as the aristocracy and the Church of England and the monarchy, things which seem to be being rendered historically anachronistic, at the centre of a kind of revived conservative project, which had the ability to reach out and appeal to a wide array of class interests, which the liberals would never have imagined as being essentially united around these historic and traditional elements. So it was a very clever trick by Disraeli, and as I say, of course, in many respects, it actually seems to have worked. And it was also, of course, in many respects, a very unlikely political programme for Disraeli at all, because Disraeli, as I'm sure many of you are aware, was the quintessential outsider. He was a Jew of Italian descent. He had not a single drop of English blood in his body. He had attended no great British public school or university, and his father was a writer and certainly not a landowner, of the kind that Disraeli attached such importance to. So that such a man was able to lead a Conservative Party and use it as a vehicle for his ideas betokens, I think, a toleration of the British people, and that they responded to this one nation message by voting out Gladstone and installing Disraeli, and then for most of the intervening years casting their votes for a party which does claim that Britain is great and Britain is worth celebrating, only vindicates the imaginative appeal of Disraelian conservatism. Thank you.